So I want to begin by talking about tradition. Some people hear the term tradition and they roll their eyes. They see it as some antiquated part of humanity that we could completely get rid of. And other people hear tradition and they put it in a spot of reverence, that it can never be changed or gotten rid of in any way. So I think, like most things in life, there's a middle ground that would be the most beneficial to us. So I'd like to look at tradition more as a tool, right? So the same way you wouldn't use a hammer when a screwdriver is required, you shouldn't use tradition when innovation is required. So what are some of the beneficial aspects of tradition we should maintain? I think the tradition that asks us only to respect those that came before us, their sacrifices and their insights, that's a valuable tradition. So an example of this would be mushrooms. So humanity used to have a much more intimate relationship with mushrooms. We ate mushrooms more often, picked them in the wild, we used them for clothing, and obviously we used them for their psilocybin effects, their ability to take us on these wild spiritual journeys inside of our own minds. Ironically, we lost a lot of that knowledge and that tradition when we became agriculturalists. But that tradition that was asking us to respect those that came before us, those that were able to determine the poisonous mushrooms from the beneficial mushrooms, even though they looked nearly identical, now that's an important part of tradition. Because those people sacrifice their time, they sacrifice their health in some situations, and they pass that knowledge on because there was no other way to determine which mushrooms were good and which mushrooms were bad. It was only through those sacrifices that we had that knowledge. So that's a beneficial form of tradition. A negative form of tradition is that which asks us not to respect the past, but instead to fear the future. So this would be an appeal to tradition to kind of hold back change, to hold back the tides of innovation. So that tradition that asks us only to fear rather than to respect is a tradition that we can do without. So let's look at this in a more modern scenario. Currently, there are many companies around the world, there are many governments that are looking to colonize Mars. They're looking to set up generational colonies on Mars. So not just an outpost for people to go to and come back to after a few months, but people to live their entire lives on, to be born on Mars and to die on Mars. One aspect of this that's not really talked about very much is social. So it's the clothing on Mars and what that might look like. So before we talk about that, I just want to talk about the two reasons that we wear clothes here on Earth. So I would say those two reasons are practical and cultural. So the practical reasons we wear clothes on Earth here is for protection from extreme temperatures, protection from the sun, protection from, or as an additive to our comfort. So think about shoes. So shoes allow us to walk over, sharp objects, uncomfortable objects, hot rocks, hot sand, all of that, and stay in relative comfort. Humanity actually has a way of doing that by building up calluses on our feet, but it takes a long time and it's uncomfortable. So most people in the West in particular choose to just stick with clothing. So these would be examples of practical uses of clothing. Now, cultural clothing would be, we wear clothing to express ourselves. So clothing is seen as an extension of our own personality. We're broadcasting that out to the world and to society at large. Another cultural reason we wear clothes is to respect our past. So a lot of people wear the same clothing that their ancestors wore because they want to carry on that tradition. There's also the cultural reason that not wearing clothes is seen as indecent and even immoral in much of the world today. You can be arrested for choosing not to wear clothes. So how do these two uses for clothing, practical and cultural, transfer over to Mars? Well, there's a cost for clothing on Mars. Textiles are not something that's readily abundant on Mars. So unless we find some way to make clothes out of Martian rock, we're going to need to bring all of that material up to Mars. And that's going to be an expensive cost, because any material that's brought up to Mars is going to be material that's brought up instead of people, instead of medicine or food or any of the basics for building an infrastructure on Mars. And bringing up tons of clothing or bringing up tons of textiles to be turned into clothing is going to take away from that cargo space. And even if we do determine a way to create clothes on Mars from some type of material on Mars, that's going to be expensive in the form of labor. People are going to have to make clothes. People are going to have to make clothes for every stage of development, if we're talking a generational colony here. So there are people, or we're going to need clothes that fit toddlers, infants, young adolescents, and adults, right? So barring some type of technology that grows as a person grows, we're going to need clothing for every stage. Not to mention the resources we'll have to expend keeping those clothes cleaned or repairing those clothes. It's a huge cost, really. So using our two reasons for wearing clothes here on Earth, would those reasons map on well to clothes on Mars? So practically, you're not going to need protection from the elements on Mars because you're going to be living in an enclosed habitat. So it's already going to, let's say it's a dome. In the dome itself, there's already going to be a protection from extreme temperatures. There's already going to be a protection from harmful radiation. And you're not going to need clothes. Now, some people might argue that you'll need clothes in the case of some type of catastrophic failure of the habitat. But that's envisioning a society that's really wearing a spacesuit from the time they're born until the time they die, which I don't think is very practical. So that's the practical reasons for wearing clothes is removed there. So what about the cultural reasons? So people will still want to express themselves, and people also might want to respect their tradition, but is that worth the cost? Is that worth the cost of creating, maintaining, and transporting clothes to Mars? So to go back to tradition, that's really what's being relied on here. If we can remove all the practical reasons for wearing clothes on Mars, it would be the traditional reasons. Now, is it asking us to respect those that came before us and the sacrifices they've made and the knowledge that they've gained? Or is it asking us to fear the future or to fear some type of change? Is it asking us to respect the fact that people on Earth, the Martian ancestors on Earth wore clothes, or is it asking us to fear the naked human form? So I don't think it's possible to transform the entirety of Earth into a nudist colony, nor do I think that'd be practical because we do still deal with extremes in temperature. But on Mars, in a controlled environment where we're able to set up a whole new society from the ground up, do we want to start from a position of shame and of fear of the human form? I would argue no. So I would argue that the Martian, barring some type of incredible technology that is yet to be discovered that can be made from materials on Mars, never needs to be washed, and grows as a person grows. I would argue that the Martian should be nude.